Southern Hemisphere, we have the point between autumn equinox and winter solstice, which is an actual astrological point for the Earth. And it is here in the Southern Hemisphere, it is Samhain or Halloween. And despite what we get told in the Southern Hemisphere, that Halloween is on the 30th of October, that is incorrect here in the Southern Hemisphere. In the Northern Hemisphere, it is on October the 31st. But for here, it is, no, wrong chart, my apologies.
Yeah, and the reason for that is because those celebrations are specific to the season that's being experienced at the time. That's why we carve pumpkins, is because at that time of year, pumpkins are abundant because it's late autumn and coming into that early winter. It is honoring and reflecting that seasonal moment of endings as all the leaves come down from the tree and we get ready to go in that more dormant time of the year coming into winter. It's a moment to really honor what's been lost or what we're letting go of, what kind of transitions and transformations and stripping back is happening.
Mm.
Um, and so even though, a month ago we were all, not that we were all, but, potentially a lot of us would have been celebrating Easter and having Easter egg hunts and having pictures of bunnies everywhere, like all these springtime
Mm.
fertile symbols, which are not so much in alignment with the Southern Hemisphere experience of the seasons. And so really what we have an opportunity for here is to be connecting seasonally and seeing how we can line the astrological moment in time with our lived experience as well.
Absolutely. And what I find, so here in the Southern Hemisphere, so, and I mean, this is also the case of the Northern Hemisphere, but they're going into high spring, which is Beltane. Here in the Southern Hemisphere, we are obviously coming into Samhain. We're coming into that last harvest of the season. We're deep, deep in autumn. In actual fact, on the Earth wheel, this would symbolize the beginning of winter. So this point between autumn equinox and winter solstice, this point where the veils are the thinnest between us and the ancestors, the third and final harvest, is the final letting go. And what I find really interesting, so this chart is on the exact point of that point between autumn equinox and winter solstice, which is May the 5th here in Australian Eastern Standard Time at 9 a.m. on the dot is the exact point between autumn equinox and winter solstice. And just looking at this chart, what I find really interesting of that moon that we spoke about, just the last chart when Mars went into Aries, has now moved from this point where it was having a conversation with Pluto, which is now in retrograde. So you can see this R there. That means it's now going backwards from an Earth perspective. It's actually not going backwards in the sky, but from an Earth perspective, it is looking like it's going backwards. If you're looking at it from a telescope from the Earth, has now moved. This moon now is with Mars. How funny. Right at this very, same degree that Mars was in a few days ago when it ingressed into Aries. And look, it's also coming back going, yeah, well, this sextile energy, this 60-degree point of these new seedlings that we're seeing from, what I'm seeing from this chart, and I really love it. It's like this veil between the ancestors. That's like, for example, on this chart would be Pluto, this platonic, like, what we said about the skeletons in the closet, or the things that have been swept under the carpet that have been gifted down the lineage, down the storyline from mother to child to and so forth, is now here in this space here at Samhain. And we're now going, well, what seeds do we want to take with us from those ancestral stories and plant something new for the children, the next generation to come? It's this very actual powerful chart for Samhain to really actually focus on what stories do we want to now pass on for our ancestral lineage going forward, given what's happening from behind. So that's really fascinating Yeah, and this spark of the idea of Aries, something brand new, like the little seed that we're holding in our hand that's so precious, that's been actioned by Mars here, that wants to take it and start, sprouting and start moving forward with whatever needs to happen next. But what we've needed to do is actually go back and have a look at the old stories and really decide, do we want to take this forward or not? I think this is the key question at this cell end, given this chart, is do we want to take these stories forward, or do we want to just leave, just not bury them, but attend to them so they don't move forward? I think this is what we're being called to do here.
Absolutely. And we can really see again how the moon imports things into reality, because the moon has brought the story from her conjunction with Pluto a couple of days earlier and brings that story into the moment when she comes into this conjunction with Mars on this day in that next couple of hours. And I think it's really important to think about this conversation from the ancestors, and really bring in the perspective of Mars here, which is, there's boldness, there's bravery, there's courage, but there's also right use of power. Like, how do we want to use that power responsibly and well? How can we be in service to our ancestors with the power that we hold by being here in this moment? And it's this moment of like, what would our ancestors do with that power, and of weaving their hopes for us, recognizing that there is a perspective and a wealth of information and understanding that our ancestors hold from the realm that they exist in, that we don't necessarily have a day-to-day connection with or view with. There's this trusting that the ancestors, I think anyway, have this larger scale sense of where we are, where we've been, where we're moving to, and to really trust that we can bring our sense in of like, what would make my ancestors proud? Like, what were they praying for when they were dreaming up me? And of
Mm.
having the martial courage and of throwing our energy and our full fiery resource, that spark of yes towards that thing. I think really, like, this is not a Venusian moment. It's not a Jupiterian moment. It's a martial moment.
Yeah.
And Pluto's bringing in that, again, that honesty, but it's the willingness to jump behind something and say yes. And, I think that Mars in Aries sometimes gets a bad rap as being impulsive. But like, can we also give ourselves permission to trust an impulse? Like, that's actually also a very precious type of magic.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that Mars in Aries, it's just like the Fool card, right? It's like stepping off the edge. I remember on the Astrology podcast talking about the shaming the signs, and Mars and Aries was like the audacity to move forward without a plan, to step off that cliff with because you're being called to it, not necessarily knowing where you're going. And it's like this, okay, this has happened, the past is, this Mars has had a conversation in the last couple of months with Pluto, Saturn, and Neptune, and it's really been worked over big time. Like, I just, when we were saying that about Mars, and with the elders, I just feel this Mars having a conversation with Saturn earlier this month, just after the Aries eclipse, actually, was like, well, what do you need to now the step into responsibility, this eldership? And now this Mars is now, even though it's a new Mars here in Aries, it doesn't feel like it feels like it's got some wisdom behind it, because it's had these conversations in the last couple of months with the bigger, heavier duty planets like Pluto and Saturn. It's just like, oh, it's coming through with it being worked over, and it doesn't feel like it feels like a new cycle, but with a, similar to like maybe a middle-aged man would have. It's not a new boy. It's not, it's someone who has lived a bit of a life and now is regenerating something new out of the wisdom that's come through with. And then what a classic time to be doing it, because that is the essence of Samhain and this third harvest. It's not something new, Like this time of the year here in the Southern Hemisphere, we're in deep autumn here. We've gone through, it's different energy to if it was at the start of spring, for example, and that's fresh and new. But we've gone through this whole cycle that started back at winter solstice last year in June 22nd, I think it was. 23. We've had such a big journey since then of, this is not a new information. This is a harvest point. So it feels like this wiser Mars that's coming through with this moon just going, well, okay, this is what the new seeds we need to plant. And exactly what we were saying before of that, what are you giving down to the children? What seeds are you passing on? And another thing that stands out in this chart here, and then we'll come to that, is this Mercury, who's now direct, starting to have this conversation with Chiron, the wounded healer. And I just feel like this Mercury, wants, what is it? That stories it's trying to communicate, but this wounded healer element of going, well, this Chiron is what stories are real and what's not from the past. That, can you move above the stories, even if they're a little bit painful, but maybe they didn't come, maybe they're not true now. Maybe they were true, 20 years ago, and when that original wounding happened, but is that true now? And what stories are we telling ourselves from the past? What stories are we telling from our ancestors that are not relevant these days, or that, times are so different these days? Can we rise above that in this Aries sign of beginnings, and change the patterning of that, and become the healing of that story for the lineages going forward? Yeah.
Absolutely. And something I think that bears mentioning is that, Pluto can also be a really difficult archetypal energy to be working with. And it's one thing to connect with it, as we've been talking about, but it doesn't always show up in more constructive or positive ways. And so what I wanted to mention is that if around this time, that sense of action or using your energy, if that's feeling really held back, if there's a lot of anxiety or overwhelm or fear around how do I rightly use or be responsible for my power, I dare say that that conversation with Pluto is coming through, asking you to have a look at something or in an area that until now has been dark, or until now hasn't had your attention. And so remembering that this is a very bold, brave Mars, and you too can tune into that bold, brave self, that if this is not feeling like an empowered moment of new energy and pivoting if that's just not feeling supported, what I would invite you into is to not feel like you have to run with something for the sake of action alone, but to spend a little bit of time with those darker, edgier parts of yourselves that might be trying to get your intention through the language of anxiety or overwhelm, or past things perhaps that you thought were put to bed and were done, not quite being done. Like just really wanting to bring that into the conversation too, that yes, Pluto, gosh, it brings such profound insight, but it can also be very corrupting, and it can be enormously difficult sometimes, those energies as well. So if that is your experience at this time, then absolutely what I would recommend is to not feel the compulsion to move just because the energy is there, and to be willing to hold yourself while you address perhaps something else that is asking for your loving, wholehearted, compassionate attention, to not look away from that thing for the sake of moving forward.
Yeah. And one thing also about this chart, and what we'll move on to next, is the Taurus new moon, is that this moon here is catching up. It's in a harvest moon as well. So this potential for things to also be coming up in this final harvest of this cycle that began with the Aries eclipse, which was conjunct Chiron, the wounded healer, like with the North Node. Like it was a pretty friggin' massive eclipse, that Aries eclipse. So this is the first, this is the last harvest of whatever was stirred up there, and coming into this this deep dark point of the skies. This is in the southern hemisphere, actually, this time of year is so dark at the dark moon. It's darker than normal. It's not like a dark moon in the midsummer. It's a dark moon in the deepest, coming into the deepest of winter. And it's so dark. And so things, when we start to come internal and inside, and we're less social, things can get stirred up here. And with that connection with Pluto as well, it's like, well, what can we see from here that we need to attend to before this new moon comes in?
That's such a good point. And I think too, it's what we can see is that evidence of the layering of the same theme over and over and over again, spoken through different modes of experience, whether it's because it's almost a dark moon and it's that darker phase of the lunar cycle, whether it's because Pluto is in dialogue here, whether it's because it's Samhain, like there's so many different ways that the story is the same, which is, oh, I see that you're in this decaying, letting go, harvest moment. And then we look at something else and go, ah, I see, you're in this decaying harvest. Ah, I see. And it's this, this repetition of that theme. And what you were saying, Yvonne, just made me really realize that what a potent moment this is to think about, what are you bringing into winter solstice? 6-8 weeks from now, like what can you address now while it's talking to you, before you actually get to the bottom of the underworld, before it truly is the darkest? Like, there is still light. It is dark, but there is still light at this moment. Like, what opportunity do you have to cross your T's and dot your I's in terms of your own shadow and your own sense of self that will actually support you over the coming months?
Absolutely. And when, if have a look around you to see what's arising and what's showing up. Do you really want to take that into a new cycle for the next 12 months? Like, this is your opportunity. This is what's being called of us to look at before we go into that winter solstice moment, which is the veils, which is the space of all and nothing, that is the dreaming scape. Like, it's like attending to the things that you need to attend to so you can get a good night's sleep and wake up good the next day. That's the energy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I love that.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
actually, just last thing.
Okay.
Oh, actually, no, I thought